Sarah. The word tore out of Luke Callahan's throat before he could stop it, and the carpet bag slipped from the woman's fingers and hit the platform with a thud that silenced the entire depot. 20 years. 20 years since that name had meant anything to him, and now it stood 8 feet away, wearing a traveling dress and a stranger's wedding ring he hadn't given her yet. She had come to marry a man she'd never met. He had come to meet a bride he'd never seen. Neither of them expected the past to step off that train. Subscribe. Follow this story to the very end and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The depot at Larkspur Junction smelled like coal smoke and wet hay, and Luke Callahan had been standing under its narrow overhang for 40 minutes, turning his hat brim through his fingers like a man wringing out a wet rag. Around him, the platform filled and emptied as the noon train disgorged Crate's mail sacks, 2 drummers in cheap suits, and an old woman clutching a rooster in a wicker cage. None of them was her. None of them was the woman whose letters he'd been carrying folded in his breast pocket for the better part of 4 months, the woman who signed herself only S, and who wrote about dawn light on wheat fields like she'd memorized the exact color of it. He didn't know her face. That was the strange ache of it. He'd read her handwriting more times than he could count, traced the loops of her Y's and the careful slant of her T's, until he could have picked that penmanship out of 100 others. And yet, if she'd walked past him on the street that morning, he wouldn't have known her from Eve. "You look like a man waiting to be hanged," said Tom Riley, the station agent leaning out of his window with a grin too wide for sympathy. "Feels about the same," Luke muttered. "Relax, Callahan. Worst that happens, she takes one look at you and gets back on the train." "That a comfort, Tom?" "Wasn't meant to be." Luke almost laughed. Almost. He'd buried that particular muscle a long time ago. The one that let a man laugh easy and trust easy and love easy. And he wasn't entirely sure. 4 months of letters from a stranger calling herself S were enough to dig it back up. But something in those letters had cracked something open in him anyway. She'd written about losing her mother young. About a father who meant well but couldn't hold a house together. About wanting more than anything a place that was steady. A man who stayed. "I am not asking for romance," she'd written in her 3rd letter. "I am asking for a roof that doesn't leak and a hand that doesn't strike. If you can offer that, I believe we could build something honest between us." He'd read that line so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. The whistle screamed somewhere down the track, and Luke's stomach dropped the way it used to when he was 19 and waiting outside a girl's window with pebbles in his pocket. He hadn't felt that particular nausea in 20 years. He told himself it was nerves about the wedding, about the ranch, about whether this woman would take one look at his weathered hands and sun-cracked face and decide 34 was too old, too used up, too far gone for a fresh start. The train rolled in groaning and hissing brakes, shrieking against the rails, and steam rolled out across the platform in a gray curtain that swallowed the boots and skirts of the first passenger stepping down. Luke straightened his collar, smoothed his hair back with one hand, felt absurdly like he might be sick. Then the steam thinned, and a woman stepped down from the second car, carrying a faded carpet bag in both hands, and Luke Callahan's entire body went still, in a way it hadn't gone still since the day his father died. She was perhaps 33, 34. Dark hair pulled back beneath a traveling bonnet that had seen better seasons. A face that should have been a stranger's face, and wasn't. Couldn't be. The shape of her jaw. The particular tilt of her chin when she was bracing herself for something. The small scar above her left eyebrow that he knew came from a fall off the Whitmore's fence rail when she was 9 years old, and he'd been the one who carried her home screaming. Emma. The name left him before his mind had caught up with what his eyes were telling him, raw and disbelieving, cracking in the middle like a boy's voice breaking. The woman froze on the bottom step of the train car, one hand still gripping the iron rail, and her face went the color of cold ash. "Luke," she breathed. Not a question. Recognition hit her exactly the way it had hit him, total immediate like a physical blow. The carpet bag slipped from her fingers and struck the platform boards with a hollow thud that seemed to Luke louder than the train's own whistle. Around them, the ordinary business of the depot kept moving: a porter wheeling a cart, a child shrieking with laughter somewhere near the mail office. But inside the small space between Luke and the woman on the train steps, the entire world had gone silent and strange, 20 years collapsing into a single suspended second. Luke started and stopped because his throat had closed around the rest of the sentence. Emma said faintly. Sarah, my middle name. I've gone by it since. She stopped too. Her hand had drifted to her chest like she was checking her own heart was still beating. Since you left, Luke said. The words came out harder than he meant them. 20 years of a question he'd never gotten to ask rose up in his throat all at once. Since your whole family disappeared in the middle of the night without so much as a note pinned to the door. Emma flinched like he'd struck her. A small crowd had begun to gather at a polite, curious distance, the kind of attention a frontier town paid to any scene with the faint whiff of scandal in it. Tom Riley had gone very still in his window. The drummers in their cheap suits had stopped mid-conversation to watch. Luke? Emma's voice trembled, but she made herself climb down the last step, made herself stand on the platform, instead of retreating back into the train car, like every nerve in her body was clearly screaming at her to do. I never wanted to leave. You have to believe. I don't have to believe anything, Luke said, and the bitterness in his own voice surprised him, the way old wounds always surprise a man by how little time it takes them to reopen. I waited for a letter, any letter. One word telling me you were alive, telling me where you'd gone, telling me why. I got nothing. 20 years of nothing, Emma. I wrote, she said, and her voice cracked clean in half on the word. I wrote so many letters. Then where were they? She didn't answer. Her eyes had filled, and she pressed her lips together hard, like she was physically holding something back. Some explanation too large or too dangerous to say out loud on a public platform in front of half the town. Luke became aware distantly that his hands had curled into fists at his sides, not in anger at her, not exactly, but in the old familiar fury of a boy who'd spent months walking past an empty house, who'd asked every traveling salesman and circuit preacher if they'd seen a family matching the Whitmore's description, who'd finally at 19 made himself stop asking because the asking hurt worse than the silence. Mr. Callahan. The voice belonged to the preacher Reverend Davies, who had wandered down from the church to witness, as was custom, the arrival of the mail-order bride he was scheduled to marry in 4 days' time. He'd clearly caught the tail end of the exchange, and his eyebrows had climbed somewhere near his hairline. Is there a difficulty? No difficulty. Luke said automatically, the old habit of keeping his business private in a town that fed on gossip kicking in even through the shock. Reverend, this is Emma Whitmore, Emma said, quietly, finding her voice again, lifting her chin in that particular way Luke remembered from childhood, the way she'd always braced herself before doing something difficult. I believe Mr. Callahan and I knew each other, a long time ago. Knew each other. Luke repeated under his breath, something between a laugh and a sound of pain. Emma, you were my best friend for 12 years. You were... He stopped himself before he said the rest of it. You were the only person I ever loved before I learned not to. Perhaps. Reverend Davies said carefully, sensing the temperature of the moment, this conversation would be better continued somewhere private. Luke looked at Emma. Emma looked at Luke. 20 years of silence stretched taut between them like a wire pulled to its breaking point. My wagon's this way, Luke said finally. His voice rough, and he bent to pick up her fallen carpet bag before she could reach for it herself. His fingers brushed hers in the process, an accident, barely a touch, and he felt her flinch like the contact burned. They walked to the wagon without speaking. The town watched them go, every curtain on Main Street, twitching with the kind of attention that would have the whole valley talking about the rancher and his mail-order bride by sundown. It wasn't until they'd cleared the edge of town, the wagon wheels grinding over the rutted road toward the Callahan ranch, that Emma finally broke. You have every right to hate me, she said quietly, staring straight ahead at the road. I don't expect you to forgive 20 years in a single afternoon. I don't hate you. Luke said, and was surprised to find it was true even buried under everything else. I just don't understand. One day you were there. The next your house was empty and locked up and nobody in town would say a word about where the Whitmores had gone. Your pa wouldn't even look at me when I asked. My father made us swear, Emma said, and her voice had gone strange, careful, like she was picking her way across ice she wasn't sure would hold. He said if anyone asked even you, especially you, we were to say nothing, that it would put you in danger to know. Luke's hands tightened on the reins. Danger from what? I can't. Emma pressed her eyes shut. Not yet. Please, Luke. Not yet. He wanted to push. Every instinct in him wanted to pull the wagon to a stop right there on the road and demand the truth 20 years overdue. But something in the rigid set of her shoulders, the white-knuckled grip she had on her own hands in her lap, told him she wasn't being stubborn. She was being afraid. All right, he said instead low. Not yet. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite war. Something unsettled and waiting like the air before a storm breaks. The ranch house came into view as the sun was dipping toward the western ridgeline. Gold light pouring across the yard, and Luke watched Emma's face as she took it in the barn he'd built with his own hands after his father passed the corral fence. He'd mended 100 times the porch, where he'd spent 1,000 lonely evenings, telling himself a wife and letters from a stranger were enough to fill the silence. It's beautiful, Emma said softly, and for the first time since the depot. Something in her voice sounded like the girl he remembered. Before Luke could answer, the front door banged open, and a stout woman in an apron came hurrying down the porch steps, wiping flour from her hands onto her skirt. There you are finally, and this must be Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, Luke's housekeeper. For the better part of a decade, stopped dead at the foot of the steps, staring at Emma with an expression of dawning, unmistakable shock. Mrs. Brooks, Luke said carefully. This is Emma Whitmore, Eleanor breathed. Lord have mercy, I haven't seen that face since you were a girl of 14 running wild through these fields with this one. She nodded at Luke. I'd know you anywhere, child. You've got your mother's eyes. Emma's composure, which had held through the entire ride from town, finally cracked. Her eyes filled and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. You remember me. Remember you, sweetheart. Half this valley remembers the Whitmores. Folks talked about your family disappearing for years after. Some said you'd run from debt. Some said worse. Eleanor's gaze flicked to Luke, sharp and questioning, before softening again as she looked back at Emma. Whatever happened, you're here now, and you look half-starved and twice as tired as any bride ought to look on her wedding week. Come inside. There's stew on the stove, and a bed made up, and whatever this is between the two of you. She gestured vaguely between Luke and Emma. Can wait until you've both eaten something. It was, Luke thought, exactly the kind of practical mercy he'd come to depend on from Eleanor. Over the years, the woman simply refused to let a crisis go unfed. Emma allowed herself to be steered toward the house, casting one look back at Luke over her shoulder. There was something in that look he couldn't name relief, maybe at the reprieve, or fear that the questions were only delayed, not gone. Luke stood in the yard a long moment after they'd disappeared inside, staring at the closed door like it might give him answers the woman behind it wouldn't. 20 years he'd told himself the Whitmores leaving wasn't his business, wasn't his wound to carry. 20 years he'd built a life, a ranch, a reputation as a steady, careful man who didn't let his heart run wild the way it had at 19. And in one afternoon, all of it had cracked open like dry ground under a sudden rain. He thought about the letters in his breast pocket. 4 months of careful, honest words from a woman calling herself S. A woman who'd written about wanting a roof that didn't leak, and a hand that didn't strike a woman, who'd somehow impossibly turned out to be the girl he'd buried a tin box of dreams with under the old oak tree on the back 40, when they were children, too young to know what dreams were worth. When we grow up, let's never lose each other. He'd written that line himself, hadn't he? Or she had. He couldn't remember which of them had pressed the pencil to the paper, only that they'd agreed on it together, two children, certain the world couldn't possibly be cruel enough to separate people who loved each other. The world had been exactly that cruel. Luke pulled the bundle of letters from his pocket and stared down at the familiar, careful handwriting on the topmost page, the one that began, "Dear Mr. Callahan." In a hand he now realized he should have recognized from the start. Should have recognized from 100 notes passed under fence rails and tucked into the crook of the old oak tree if 20 years and grief hadn't worn the memory thin. I am asking for a roof that doesn't leak and a hand that doesn't strike. What had happened to her in 20 years that those were the only things she dared to ask for? Behind him, through the lit window of the kitchen, he could hear Eleanor's voice rising and falling in comforting tones, and beneath it, quieter. Emma laughing just slightly at something, a sound so unexpectedly familiar, it sent a fresh ache through his chest. He didn't go inside. Not yet. He stood in the deepening blue of the evening, the letters clutched in one hand, and let himself feel for the first time in 20 years the full weight of a grief he'd never properly been allowed to finish grieving. Because Emma Whitmore wasn't dead. She wasn't lost to some unknowable fate he'd long since stopped imagining. She was 40 feet away, behind a lit window, eating stew at his kitchen table, wearing a stranger's promise of marriage that had somehow impossibly turned out to belong to him all along. And tomorrow, he was going to get his answers, every single one of them, no matter how long they'd been buried, no matter how much it cost either of them to dig them up. The porch boards creaked behind him. He turned to find Eleanor standing in the doorway, her expression unusually grave for a woman who'd just fed two shocked strangers a bowl of stew apiece. "She's asleep already," Eleanor said quietly. "Exhausted clean through. Whatever she's been carrying these 20 years, Luke, it's sitting heavy on that girl. I could see it the moment she stepped through the door. You said folks talked about debt. Or worse." Eleanor's mouth tightened. "There were rumors back then, ugly ones, about her father crossing the wrong men in town, men with money, men with reach. Nobody ever proved anything. The Whitmores were just gone one morning, and a week later nobody dared bring the subject up at all. Like the whole town had been told to forget they existed." Luke felt something cold settle low in his stomach. Told by who? That, Eleanor said, is the question, isn't it? She left him there on the porch, with the letters still clutched in his hand, and the first stars coming out hard and bright over the ridgeline. And Luke Callahan stood very still in the deepening dark, understanding, with sudden bone-deep certainty, that whatever had driven Emma Whitmore out of this valley 20 years ago hadn't finished with either of them yet. Morning came hard and bright through the kitchen window, and Emma was already awake when Luke came down, sitting stiff-backed at the table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she clearly wasn't drinking. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." He hadn't, and there was no point lying about it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the silence thick with everything that had been left unspoken on the ride home the night before. "I want to ask you something," Luke said finally, "and I want you to actually answer it this time." Emma's hands tightened around the cup. "All right." "Why didn't you write?" "I told you. I did write." "Then where were the letters, Emma?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, 20 years of waiting compressed into 4 words. "I checked the post office in this town every week for the better part of a year. I asked every drifter who came through if they'd heard the name Whitmore. I wasn't imagining that silence." Emma set the cup down with a trembling hand, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were wet and fierce at once. "My father burned them." The kitchen went very still. "What?" "Every letter I wrote I gave to him to post, because he wouldn't let me near a post office myself, not for the first 2 years after we left. He said it was too dangerous. I believed him. I was 14. Luke? I believed whatever he told me because he was terrified. And when a man like my father is that frightened, you don't ask questions, you just do as you're told." Her voice cracked. "It wasn't until I was 16 that I caught him doing it. Burning one in the cook stove. I screamed at him. I called him a liar and a coward, and worse. He just stood there and let me say it like he'd already decided the words couldn't hurt him, because he deserved every one of them. Luke felt something twist hard in his chest. Why would he do that? Because he was protecting us, Emma said, and the words came out bitter, worn thin from being turned over 1,000 times in her own mind. Or so he believed. He thought if you knew where we were, if anyone in this town knew where we were, it would put a target not just on us, but on you too for knowing. A target from who? Emma hesitated, and Luke watched the old fear cross her face again, the same fear that had stopped her on the wagon ride the day before. There were men, she said carefully. Back then. My father worked the land office in town before we left. You remember that much, I know you do. He kept the deeds, the surveys, the boundary records for half the valley. I remember. He found something in those records he wasn't supposed to find. Discrepancies. Land that had been recorded one way and then quietly changed boundaries, redrawn on paper that didn't match what was actually surveyed in the ground. Whole parcels that should have belonged to homesteading families getting folded piece by piece into one man's holdings. Luke's stomach went cold. Whose holdings? Emma's jaw tightened. I don't know the name. Not for certain. My father never said it out loud, not even to my mother. Not where I could hear it. He just said there were men with money and reach who didn't want the truth coming out, and that the safest thing for all of us was to disappear and stay disappeared. So you ran. We ran, Emma said quietly. In the middle of the night. I didn't even get to say goodbye to you. I begged my father to let me leave you a note, just a line, just I'm sorry, and he wouldn't allow it. He said even that much could be traced. Her voice broke entirely now. I have hated him for that, Luke. For 20 years I have hated him for taking that choice away from me. Luke sat with that for a long moment, the old anger in his chest shifting, reshaping itself around a truth he hadn't expected, that the girl who vanished hadn't chosen the silence. It had been chosen for her. Where's your father now? Dead, Emma said simply. 3 years passed. My mother before that. There's no one left who knows the full truth except me, and even what I know is only pieces. He never told me everything. I think he was afraid that if something happened to him, the less I knew, the safer I'd be. And yet you came back here, Luke said slowly. Of all the places in the territory you could have gone looking for a husband, you came back to Larkspur Junction. Emma's eyes met his steady now, despite the tears still standing in them. I didn't know it was you, Luke. I swear that on my mother's grave. I answered an advertisement in a newspaper out of Cheyenne. A rancher looking for a wife, decent and hardworking, willing to build a life from nothing. I didn't see your name until I was already on the train. And by then it was too late to turn back, even if I'd wanted to. A faint, helpless smile crossed her face. And some part of me, I think some part of me wanted it to be true. Wanted it to somehow be you, even though I knew it couldn't be because the world doesn't work that neatly. Apparently it does, Luke said, and something in his chest, some old locked door, creaked open half an inch. The days that followed fell into an uneasy, careful rhythm. Luke kept to his ranch work, mending fence-moving cattle, the endless physical labor that had been his refuge for a decade, while Emma threw herself into the house with a fierce, almost desperate energy, as though proving her usefulness might somehow answer questions her words couldn't. She organized the pantry that Eleanor had let go to chaos for years. She mended 3 shirts Luke had been meaning to throw out. She learned the names of every ranch hand within 2 days, and remembered which ones took their coffee black and which ones needed 3 sugars, a small kindness that had every man on the place half in love with her by the end of the week. She's not what I expected, said Cal Reston, the foreman, watching Emma cross the yard with a basket of mending balanced on one hip. Mail-order brides, you hear stories. Soft hands. Helpless. That one's worked harder this week than half my crew. She grew up here, Luke said. Or near enough. She knows ranch work. Cal raised an eyebrow. That's so. Folks in town are already talking, you know. About the 2 of you. About what happened at the depot. Let them talk. Just saying, boss. Word travels fast in a town this size. Luke knew it did. He'd grown up watching the same gossip machine grind through every scrap of scandal the Valley produced, and he had no illusions that his and Emma's reunion, public raw witnessed by half the platform, would stay quiet for long. It was Eleanor who brought the first real trouble to his attention 3 days later, setting a folded newspaper down on the kitchen table with more force than the gesture strictly required. "You'll want to read that," she said grimly. Luke unfolded it. The Larkspur Junction Sentinel, a 4-page rag that mostly printed cattle prices and church socials, had run a small item on its second page under the headline, "Return of the Whitmore Family Stirs Old Questions." His stomach dropped as he read. Residents with long memories will recall the sudden and unexplained departure of the Whitmore family some 20 years past. The recent arrival of Miss Emma Whitmore, now betrothed to local rancher Luke Callahan, has revived speculation regarding the circumstances of that departure, including persistent but unconfirmed rumors involving irregularities in historical land office records during the elder Whitmore's tenure as clerk. "Who wrote this?" Luke's voice had gone flat and hard. "No byline," Eleanor said. "But I'll tell you who will have read it by sundown. Everyone who matters in this valley, and a few who fancy themselves more important than they are." Emma had come into the kitchen behind them and gone pale, reading over Luke's shoulder. "They know," she whispered. "Somehow, after 20 years, someone still cares enough to put this in the paper." "Or someone wants the valley reminded," Luke said grimly, before they're reminded of something else. He didn't like the shape that thought was taking. If Emma's father really had uncovered fraud in the land records 2 decades ago, and if whoever was responsible was still alive, still powerful, still holding the same land they'd allegedly stolen, then this article wasn't gossip. It was a warning shot. "I need to see the old land records," Emma said suddenly, her voice steadying with sudden purpose. "If my father found discrepancies back then and nothing was ever corrected, they'd still be sitting in the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Public record if you know what you're looking for." "That's a 2-day ride." "I know what it is, Luke." Emma's chin lifted in that old familiar way. "But I've spent 20 years not knowing the truth of what destroyed my family. I'm done waiting for someone else to hand it to me." He went with her. There was never really a question of doing otherwise, though he told himself it was about propriety, about a man not letting his intended bride ride 2 days alone, with God knew what kind of trouble stirred up by a newspaper article. The truth, which he admitted only to himself somewhere around the second hour of the ride, was that he couldn't bear the thought of her riding into whatever waited at the end of that road without him beside her. They left Eleanor in charge of the ranch and rode out at first light, and somewhere on that long stretch of territorial road, with nothing but sage and sky and the steady rhythm of hooves to fill the silence, the old ease between them began cautiously to return. "You remember the creek?" Emma asked apropos of nothing somewhere around mid-morning. "The one behind the Hendersons' place where you fell in trying to catch that catfish with your bare hands." "I caught it," Emma said primly. "Eventually. After I had to pull you out half-drowned first." A minor detail. Despite everything, Luke felt the corner of his mouth pull upward, the first real, unguarded smile he'd allowed himself since the depot. "You were the most stubborn child I ever met. I prefer determined. You once decided you were going to teach yourself to ride bareback because Tommy Riggs said girls couldn't, and you broke your wrist doing it. And then I learned to ride bareback anyway, wrist and all the following spring." "That you did." The memory hung warm between them for a moment before Emma's smile faded, something more solemn taking its place. "I thought about you, you know. All those years. Every place we landed, and we landed in a lot of places. Luke moving every year or two whenever my father got nervous enough, I used to wonder what you were doing. Whether you'd married, whether you'd forgotten me entirely." "I never forgot you," Luke said quietly. "I told myself I had. Told myself it was easier that way. But I never did." Emma looked at him for a long moment, something fragile and hopeful crossing her face, before she looked away back toward the road ahead, like she didn't trust herself to hold his gaze any longer. They made camp that night a half-day's ride from Cheyenne, and it was over a small fire with the territorial sky spread vast and star-thick above them, that Emma finally told him. The rest of it, the pieces her father had never fully explained, assembled now from fragments she'd carried alone for 20 years. "There was a name?" she said slowly, staring into the flames. "I heard it once through a door the night before we left. My father was arguing with my mother, and he said it just once, like the word itself frightened him. Vance." Luke went very still. "Walter Vance." Emma's eyes snapped to his. "You know that name. Everyone in this valley knows that name." Luke's jaw had tightened, his voice gone low and careful. "Walter Vance owns half the land between here and the river. Came into money sudden folks always said right around 20 years back. Built that big house on the ridge. Sits on the Territorial Land Commission now." "The Land Commission," Emma repeated, and Luke watched the pieces assemble themselves behind her eyes in real time, the same way they were assembling in his own mind. The very body that would have final say over any disputed boundary records. "If your father found proof, Vance was forging surveys 20 years ago," Luke said slowly, "and Vance is still alive, still rich, still sitting on the commission that would judge any challenge to those records. Then he had every reason in the world to make sure my family disappeared?" Emma finished, her voice gone tight and cold. "And every reason still today to make sure the truth stays buried." The fire popped and crackled between them, and somewhere in the dark beyond the firelight, a coyote called out long and lonesome across the plain. "There's something else," Emma said, quieter now. "Something I haven't told you." Luke's stomach tightened. "What?" "My father didn't just find the discrepancies. He copied them. Before we fled, he made his own copies of the original survey records, the true boundaries before anyone redrew them. He kept them hidden his whole life. I found them after he died 3 years ago going through his things." She drew a slow breath. "I have them, Luke. I brought them with me. They're sewn into the lining of my carpet bag." Luke stared at her, the full weight of what she was saying landing slow and heavy. "You've been carrying proof of a 20-year-old land fraud scheme in your luggage. I didn't know what else to do with it. I couldn't leave it behind, and I couldn't trust it to anyone, not until I understood who I could trust." Her eyes met his steady, despite the fear plainly written across her face. "I trust you, Luke. I think I've trusted you since the moment I saw your face on that platform, even through 20 years of silence. But you should know what you're agreeing to marry into. This isn't just an old wound between us anymore. If Vance finds out those records still exist, finds out I'm here, finds out what I'm carrying, he'll come after you," Luke said grimly, "the same way he came after your father." "Yes." The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across both their faces, and Luke felt the old protective fury rising in him again, not the bitter, wounded anger of the depot platform, but something cleaner, fiercer, entirely focused outward now instead of in. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance," Luke said. "We get to that land office. We find the official records, compare them against what your father copied. We build the case properly legally, so airtight that even a man with Vance's money and reach can't bury it twice." Emma's eyes filled, and for the first time since the depot she reached across the small space between them and took his hand, her fingers cold from the night air but steady. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for not running the other direction the moment you understood what kind of trouble I'd brought to your door." "Emma." Luke turned his hand to clasp hers properly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You didn't bring trouble to my door. You brought 20 years of an answer I never stopped needing. The trouble was always there, sitting on that ridge in his big house, getting fatter on land that never belonged to him. We're just finally going to do something about it." They reached Cheyenne the following afternoon, the territorial capital sprawling and noisy after the quiet of the trail, and Luke watched Emma's spine straighten as they approached the squat brick building that housed the land office. Watched her transform almost visibly from the frightened girl who'd fled in the night into the steady, capable woman who'd spent 20 years preparing, even without knowing it, for exactly this moment. "Ready?" he asked as they tied the horses outside, Emma's hand drifted briefly to the carpet bag slung over her shoulder to the hidden seam where her father's 20-year-old proof lay waiting. "I've been ready since the night I was 9 years old and watched my father burn the first letter I ever wrote you," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Let's go find out exactly how much trouble Walter Vance is in." They walked up the steps together, and behind them, unnoticed in the busy Cheyenne Street, a man in a dark coat who had been watching the land office entrance for the better part of an hour folded his newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and walked quickly away in the direction of the telegraph office. The clerk at the front desk of the land office was a thin, balding man with ink-stained fingers and the harried look of someone who'd spent 30 years buried under other people's paperwork, and he barely glanced up when Luke and Emma approached. "Records request. We need to see the original survey filings for the Larkspur Junction District." Emma said, her voice steadier than Luke had heard it since the depot. "Specifically, anything filed between 1865 and 1867 under the clerkship of Daniel Whitmore." The clerk's pen paused mid-scratch. He looked up properly now, studying Emma's face with sudden sharpened attention. "Whitmore. That name rings a bell, though I couldn't tell you why." "It shouldn't matter why," Luke said evenly, stepping slightly forward. "We'd like to see the records. That's a public request, isn't it?" "Public, sure." The clerk set down his pen, wiped his hands on his trousers, and disappeared into the back without further comment, leaving them standing at the counter in a silence that stretched longer than Luke liked. "You're worried?" Emma murmured. "I don't like how long that's taking." It took nearly 20 minutes. When the clerk finally returned, he was carrying a thin folder considerably thinner than the years it was meant to cover, should have produced, and something in his expression had changed. Gone. Careful. Guarded. "This is everything we have on file for that district, and those years," he said, sliding the folder across the counter. Emma opened it with hands that had gone very still and very controlled, the way Luke imagined a surgeon's hands might go still before the first cut. She flipped through page after page of surveys, boundary descriptions, filing stamps, and stopped. "This is wrong," she said quietly. "Wrong how? There should be at least 3 more parcels in here. The Garrett homestead, the Hendricks claim, the old Pruitt boundary along the river." Her finger traced down the thin stack again, faster now, almost frantic. "They're not here. Someone's pulled them." The clerk's face had gone carefully blank in the particular way of a man who knew more than he was saying and had been paid one way or another to keep saying nothing. "Records get misfiled," he said. 20 years is a long time. Records don't misfile themselves into non-existence." Emma snapped, and Luke saw for the first time real fire in her. Not the careful, frightened woman from the depot, but the daughter of a man who'd risked everything for the truth. She reached into her carpet bag and drew out a bundle of yellowed papers tied with twine gone brittle with age and set them on the counter with a hand that trembled only slightly. "My father's copies," she said to Luke low. "The originals before anything was changed." The clerk's eyes went wide at the sight of the bundle, and for just a moment something flickered across his face that looked very much like fear. "Where did you get those?" "That's not your concern," Luke said. "What is your concern is telling us who came in here and pulled 3 parcels worth of survey records sometime in the last 20 years, and who paid them to do it." The clerk's mouth opened and closed twice before he found his voice. I wasn't even working here 20 years ago. I started in 79. Whatever happened before that, I wouldn't know." "But you know something," Emma pressed. "I can see it on your face." The clerk glanced nervously toward the back office, then leaned forward across the counter, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There's a man comes in here time to time, pays good money to certain folks for certain favors, never asks for much, just to know if anyone comes around asking about old Larkspur district filings. I'm not saying who, I'm not saying anything. But if you 2 walked in here asking about Whitmore filings, somebody's going to know about it inside the hour." "Vance," Luke said flatly. The clerk's silence was answer enough. "We need certified copies of what's left in that file," Emma said quickly, gathering herself. "And I want it on record officially that 3 parcels worth of documentation related to this district appear to be missing from the public archive. Today's date, Your name on the filing." The clerk hesitated, glancing again toward the back office. Weighing, Luke could see it plainly. Whatever fear he carried of Vance's reach against the much closer, much more immediate authority of a woman standing in front of him, demanding her legal rights to a public document. "All right," he said, finally swallowing hard. "All right. Give me 20 minutes." They left Cheyenne by mid-afternoon with certified copies in hand, and a growing uneasy certainty that the man in the dark coat who'd been loitering near the land office that morning hadn't been there by accident. "He'll know by tonight," Emma said as they rode. "That we were here. That we're asking questions. Let him know." Luke's jaw was set hard, his eyes scanning the empty road ahead out of old habit. "We've got the proof now. Your father's copies, plus an official record that the originals have been tampered with. That's enough to bring before a territorial judge." "It's enough to bring before a judge Vance doesn't already own," Emma said grimly. "He sits on the land commission, Luke. You think his money stops there?" The thought settled cold in Luke's stomach because she wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. A man who could make survey records disappear for 20 years and keep an entire town's collective memory carefully steered away from the truth wasn't a man who'd hesitate to reach into a courtroom if it came to that. They made camp again that night, the fire smaller, the silence between them heavier with the weight of what they'd uncovered. Emma sat with her father's papers spread across her lap, reading them by firelight for what Luke guessed was the 100th time in her life, searching perhaps for some detail that might finally make sense of the wreckage Vance had made of her family. "He was a good man," she said quietly, not looking up. "My father. People only remember him as the clerk who ran off in the night like he had something to hide. They never knew he ran because he refused to lie." "I believe that," Luke said. "Do you?" Emma's eyes lifted to his raw and searching. "Because I spent years being angry at him, Luke. Angry that his honesty cost me you. Cost me this town, this life, 20 years I can never get back. It wasn't until he was dying that he told me, really told me why he'd done it. He said a man who stays quiet about a wrong he could have stopped is no better than the man who committed it." "He sounds like he raised you right," Luke said softly. "Even if it cost you both everything." Emma's breath caught, and for a moment the old grief and the new fragile hope tangled together plainly on her face. "I used to think loving you was the one good thing I lost that night. Now I wonder if it's the one thing I might actually get back." Luke reached across the fire and took her hand again, the gesture becoming familiar, now an anchor point between two people, relearning how to trust the ground beneath them. "You're not going to lose anything else," he said, low and certain. "Not while I've got breath in me." It was perhaps a foolish promise for a man to make against an enemy as large and entrenched as Walter Vance. But Luke meant every word of it, and something in Emma's face told him she believed him. They rode back into Larkspur Junction 2 days later to find the town humming with a tension Luke recognized immediately as trouble, the particular quiet of people who knew something was coming and didn't want to be the ones caught standing in its path. Eleanor met them at the door, her face tight with worry. "There's been men out here," she said without preamble. 2 days running, riding the property line, not saying a word to anyone, just watching the house. "Vance's men," Luke said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know whose men, but they weren't friendly, and they weren't subtle about it either." Eleanor's eyes flicked to Emma. "And there's a letter come for you, child, delivered by hand this morning. No return address." Emma's face had gone pale even before she took the envelope from Eleanor's outstretched hand. She broke the seal with fingers that weren't quite steady, and Luke watched her read, watched the blood drain further from her face with every line. "What does it say?" Emma's voice when it came was barely above a whisper. "It says my father was a thief who deserved what he got. It says some families are better off staying disappeared. It says—" Her hand trembled so badly the paper rattled. "It says it would be a shame if history repeated itself." Luke took the letter from her hand and read it himself, his jaw clenching tighter with every word, fury rising in him, slow and absolute. "This is a threat," he said. A direct threat on paper. Unsigned. Emma said bitterly. Untraceable. Exactly the kind of thing a man like Vance would send close enough to terror that I understand exactly what he's saying, far enough from evidence that no court would ever convict him on the strength of it. Then we don't wait for him to make the next move. Luke set his voice hard with new resolve. We go to the territorial marshal. Today. We bring the certified records, your father's copies, this letter, all of it. We make this official before he has a chance to bury it the way he buried it 20 years ago. Emma looked at him for a long moment, something steadying behind her eyes despite the fear still plainly written there. 20 years ago my father tried to do this alone, she said quietly. It cost him everything. It cost us everything. You're not alone this time, Luke said. Whatever happens, Emma, whatever this costs, you're not facing it alone. The territorial marshal's office sat at the edge of town. A squat building Luke had passed 1,000 times without ever once stepping inside. And the marshal himself, a weathered, careful man named Hutchins, who'd held the post for the better part of 15 years, listened to their account with a stillness that gave away nothing of what he was thinking. He examined the certified copies. He read the threatening letter twice. He studied Daniel Whitmore's 20-year-old survey copies with the slow, methodical attention of a man who understood exactly how much weight such documents might carry, and exactly how much danger came attached to them. This is serious business, Hutchins said, finally setting the papers down. If even half of what's documented here holds up, you're talking about fraud against the territorial government itself, going back 2 decades. That's not a local matter I can settle with a strongly worded conversation. That needs to go before a federal land commission inquiry. How long would that take? Emma asked. Months likely. Could be longer. Hutchins' gaze flicked between them, steady and assessing. And I'll tell you, plain Miss Whitmore, Walter Vance is not a man without friends in high places. He'll fight this with every resource he's got, and he's got plenty. We understand, Luke said. We're not asking for easy. We're asking for justice that's 20 years overdue. Hutchins studied them both a long moment, something that might have been respect settling into the lines of his weathered face. All right, I'll file the formal complaint today. Get word to the Territorial Commission in Cheyenne. In the meantime, his eyes hardened. I'd advise you both to be careful. A man cornered by 20 years of buried fraud is a man with nothing left to lose. That's the most dangerous kind there is. They left the marshal's office with the weight of the formal complaint now officially set in motion. But Luke felt no relief in it, only a tightening dread, the sense of a clock that had just begun somewhere unseen, ticking down towards something neither of them could yet name. That feeling proved itself justified faster than either of them expected. They were 2 days from the ranch, the formal complaint freshly filed, when smoke appeared on the western horizon, thin and gray at first, then thickening fast, climbing in a column too large and too dark to be anything but disaster. That's coming from the direction of the ranch, Eleanor said, her face going white, having ridden out to meet them on the road with news that couldn't wait. Luke didn't need her to finish the thought. He was already spurring his horse forward. Emma close behind him, both of them riding hard toward the rising smoke, with a fear too large for words. The formal complaint, the certified records, even the threatening letter, all forgotten in the sudden terrible certainty that Walter Vance had decided talk was finished and that whatever came next would be measured not in courtrooms and filings, but in fire. The barn was already half engulfed by the time Luke and Emma reached the ranch flames, clawing up through the hayloft in great orange sheets, and the air was thick with the screaming of trapped animals and the shouting of men already fighting a battle they had no chance of winning without more hands. The horses. Cal Reston was bellowing, half his shirt, scorched black, dragging a panicked mare out through the side door by her halter, while 2 other hands beat at the spreading flames with wet sacking that did almost nothing against a fire already too large to fight that way. Luke was off his horse before it had fully stopped, throwing the reins to Eleanor, without a word, already running toward the barn, with every instinct screaming at him to save what could still be saved. Luke, wait! Emma's voice cracked behind him, but he didn't wait. Couldn't wait. not with the sound of cattle bawling in terror somewhere inside that wall of smoke and heat. "Get buckets! Anyone not already fighting this? Get buckets and get to the well now." His voice cut through the chaos with the hard authority of a man used to being obeyed, and ranch hands who'd been standing frozen with shock snapped into motion. Emma didn't run for buckets. She ran straight for the corral gate, yanking it open with hands that didn't shake, despite everything driving the terrified milling horses out into the open field, where the fire couldn't reach them, moving among panicked animals with a calm, steady competence that made even Cal rest and pause mid-stride to stare. "Get back from there, it's not safe," one of the younger hands shouted at her. "Then help me instead of telling me to stop." Emma shot back, already swinging the gate wider, already reaching for the next frightened animal's halter. The fire roared higher, the heat of it pressing against every face within 100 yards, and for one terrible stretch of minutes, it seemed like nothing they did would be enough. The barn was going to burn to the ground, no matter how many buckets of water they threw at it, and the only question left was how much else the flames would take with it. Then Luke spotted it. The wind shifting, carrying sparks toward the house itself, toward Eleanor's kitchen, and the bedroom where Emma had slept these past weeks, and every fragile, hard-won piece of the life they were trying to build. "The house!" he bellowed. "Wet the roof now, all hands on the house." What followed was perhaps the longest 40 minutes of Luke Callahan's life, men and women working side by side in a desperate chain of buckets and wet blankets. Emma climbing onto the porch roof herself with a soaked quilt to beat out embers before they could catch Eleanor directing the bucket line with the calm precision of a woman who'd clearly imagined this exact disaster before and refused to let it claim her kitchen. By the time the worst of the flames had been beaten back, the barn was a smoking ruin. Half its frame collapsed, the loss of feed and tack and 2 horses, too slow to be saved, sitting heavy and silent over the exhausted soot-blackened group gathered in the yard. But the house stood. The corral stood. The people stood, exhausted and singed but alive, and Luke understood with sudden clarity that the fire hadn't started itself. Vance. He said the name coming out of him like a curse, staring at the smoldering ruin of his barn. "We don't know that for certain," Cal said carefully, wiping soot from his face with a sleeve already black with it. "Don't we?" Luke's voice had gone hard and cold. 2 days after we file a formal complaint against the man. 2 days after his men have been seen riding our property line. You think this is coincidence, Cal? Nobody answered him because nobody believed it was. Emma came to stand beside him, her face streaked with soot and exhaustion. Her hands raw from hauling water, and she slid her fingers into his without a word, the simple gesture saying everything words couldn't in that moment. "He's escalating," she said quietly. "The letter wasn't enough to scare us off, so now he's showing us what he's willing to burn to make his point." "Then he's about to learn what he's willing to lose," Luke said grimly, "because I am done being patient." They worked through what remained of the night, assessing the damage, and it wasn't until the gray light of dawn was creeping over the ridgeline that Luke finally let himself sit down on the porch steps, every muscle in his body aching the adrenaline that had carried him through the fire finally draining away and leaving exhaustion in its place. Emma sat down beside him without being asked close enough that her shoulder pressed against his, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I almost lost everything tonight," Luke said finally. "The barn, the stock, maybe the house if the wind had turned worse." "I know. And do you know what I kept thinking the whole time I was fighting that fire?" He turned to look at her, his voice rough with something that wasn't entirely exhaustion. "I kept thinking none of it matters. Not the barn, not the stock, not even the house. The only thing I was actually afraid of losing was you." Emma's breath caught audibly. "Luke, 20 years ago, I lost you once, and I told myself it was the worst thing that could ever happen to me, and I built a whole careful, guarded life around making sure I never let myself care about anything that much again." His hand found hers, gripping it tight. "And then you stepped off that train, and every wall I built came down in about 30 seconds, and tonight, watching that fire, all I could think was that I would burn this whole ranch to the ground myself before I'd let anything happen to you." Don't say things like that, Emma whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. Not when there's a man out there who's already proven he'll burn things down to get what he wants. I'm not saying it to frighten you. I'm saying it because it's true. Luke turned fully toward her now, his free hand coming up to gently brush a streak of ash from her cheek. I loved you when we were children, Emma, before either of us understood what that word was supposed to mean. And I think some part of me never stopped, not in 20 years, not through all the loneliness and all the letters I wrote to a stranger who turned out to be you all along. I'm not asking you to feel the same. I know we've got 20 years of distance to close, and a fire still smoking in the yard, and a man who'd burn this whole valley before he lets the truth out. But I needed you to know it. Whatever happens next. Emma's hand trembled in his, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I never stopped either, Luke. I told myself for years it was a child's love, the kind you outgrow, the kind that doesn't survive 20 years and 100 different towns, and a father who made me bury every piece of my past just to keep us safe. But the moment I saw your face on that platform, every single thing I'd told myself about outgrowing you turned out to be a lie I'd been telling myself to survive the leaving. The first light of true morning was breaking over the ridge, now gold and impossibly soft against the wreckage of the night before, and Luke leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. And when she didn't, he kissed her gentle at first, then deeper. 20 years of longing finally finding its answer in the quiet, exhausted dawn. They broke apart slowly, foreheads resting together, and for one suspended moment, the fire, the threats, the 20 years of separation all fell away, leaving only the simple, undeniable truth that had been waiting beneath all of it the entire time. Whatever happens next, Emma murmured against his mouth, we face it together. The formal hearing came faster than anyone expected. Word from the Territorial Commission in Cheyenne, arriving by rider just 6 days after the fire, summoning Walter Vance, Emma Whitmore, and any relevant witnesses to appear before a federal land inquiry the following week. 6 days, Hutchins said, when he rode out personally to deliver the news, his weathered face grave. That's unusually fast for a commission inquiry. Either someone up in Cheyenne smelled something rotten the moment they saw those records, or Vance is pulling strings to rush this through before more evidence can surface. Luke finished grimly. Could be either, Hutchins admitted. Could be both. Either way, you'd best be ready, and you'd best be careful between now and then. A man who'll burn a barn to send a message isn't going to sit quiet while a federal inquiry decides his fate. He wasn't wrong. In the days that followed, the threats grew bolder. A dead crow left on the porch railing one morning, its meaning unmistakable, even unspoken. A rider who shadowed Emma's wagon into town and back, without ever quite closing the distance enough to be confronted directly. A whispered warning passed along by the sympathetic land office clerk in Cheyenne, smuggled north by a traveling preacher, that Vance had been seen meeting privately with 2 commission members the week prior. He's trying to buy the outcome before the hearing even starts, Emma said, reading the warning by lamplight, her face drawn tight with worry. Then we make sure the evidence speaks louder than whatever he's paying for, Luke said. Your father's copies, the certified record of the missing files, the threatening letter, the fire. Hutchins can testify to the timing of that, even without proof. Vance said it himself. The pattern alone tells a story. It might not be enough. It has to be enough. Luke's jaw set hard. 20 years, Emma. 20 years your father carried this alone, and it cost him everything. You're not carrying it alone. Not this time. The night before the hearing, neither of them slept. They sat together on the porch in the cool dark. Emma's father's papers spread between them one final time, going over every detail, every date, every discrepancy, until the words blurred together from sheer repetition. There's something I haven't told you, Emma said quietly somewhere past midnight. Something I found in my father's papers near the bottom of the stack. A name I didn't recognize until recently. What name? A witness. Someone who apparently helped Vance falsify the original surveys back when this all started. A surveyor named Jacob Reese. Emma's eyes lifted to Luke's, something urgent in them. He's still alive, Luke. Still living 2 counties over, working as a blacksmith, now far from the surveying trade entirely. If he could be persuaded to testify to confirm in his own words what he did, and for whom, that would be the difference between our word against Vance's and an actual confession. Luke finished, understanding dawning fast. We need to find him before the hearing. There's no time. The hearing is tomorrow. Luke was already on his feet, pulling his coat from the hook by the door. Then I ride tonight. Luke, it's 2 counties. You'll never make it back in time. I'll make it, Luke said with a certainty that came less from confidence and more from sheer refusal to accept any other outcome. I've ridden harder distances for less reason than saving the woman I love from a man who burned my barn to silence her. Watch the house. Lock the doors. I'll be back by morning, Reese in tow, if I have to throw him over my saddle myself. Emma caught his arm before he could leave, her eyes fierce and frightened all at once. Be careful, please. I can't lose you the same way I lost everything else. You're not losing anyone, Luke said, pressing a fierce, quick kiss to her forehead. Not tonight. Not ever again. He rode out into the dark with nothing but a half-remembered description of a blacksmith's forge 2 counties over and 20 years of injustice driving him forward. And somewhere behind him, Emma stood on the porch in the cold night air, watching until even the sound of hooves had faded entirely into the dark, praying with everything she had left that the morning would bring him home in time. 3 years had passed since the wedding beneath the oak tree, and the ranch had grown into something Luke barely recognized from the lonely, half-built operation he'd run before Emma stepped off that train. New fencing stretched across pastures that had once gone fallow for lack of hands to work them. The barn, rebuilt and reinforced, now held twice the stock it had before the fire. And the house itself had grown too. A second story added the previous spring rooms, enough for the children, and for the kind of life neither Luke nor Emma had quite dared to imagine for themselves 20 years before. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when the letter arrived, carried out from town by one of the hands, and Eleanor Gray, now at the Temples, but no less formidable in the kitchen, handed it to Emma with the particular caution of a woman who'd learned over the years that letters in this household sometimes carried more weight than their size suggested. Federal seal on it, Eleanor said. Cheyenne postmark. Emma's hands stilled over the bread she'd been kneading. 3 years was a long time for old business to stay quiet, and some old instinct, some leftover wariness from the months of fire and threat tightened in her chest before she'd even broken the seal. Luke, she called, and something in her voice brought him in from the porch within seconds, wiping his hands on his trousers, his face already creased with concern. What is it? Emma read in silence for a long moment, her expression shifting from wariness to something else entirely. Something that looked strangely like grief and relief tangled together. It's about the Garrett land, she said finally. The federal restoration process. They've finished it. All 3 parcels, Garrett, Hendricks, Pruitt, formally returned to the surviving families, effective this spring. Her voice caught. And there's a personal note here from the lead investigator. He says the case against Vance closed permanently last month. Luke went very still. Closed how? He died, Emma said quietly. In Montana, under another name, it seems. A heart attack alone in a boarding house room, the report says. No family came to claim the body. She set the letter down slowly, her hands trembling only slightly. Now the old fear finally fully releasing its grip after 3 long years of glancing over her shoulder, of locking doors a little more carefully than strictly necessary, of a wariness that had become so habitual she'd nearly forgotten it wasn't simply how she lived now. He's gone, she whispered. Truly gone. Not hiding somewhere, not waiting to come back and finish what he started. Just gone. Luke crossed the kitchen and pulled her into his arms, and Emma let herself sink into him fully, the tension she'd carried for 3 years finally draining out of her shoulders. It's done, he murmured into her hair. Emma, it's actually done. She laughed, a startled, watery sound, half sob and half genuine joy, and pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears that had nothing to do with grief. I don't know what to do with myself, she admitted. I've spent so many years braced for the other shoe to drop. I don't quite know how to stand without that weight anymore. You'll learn, Luke said, smiling, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. I imagine it takes practice standing without a weight you've carried that long. But you've got time now. We've got time. The news of Vance's death and the final restoration of the stolen land spread through Larkspur Junction within days, and the town which had once watched Luke and Emma's reunion with curious, gossiping eyes now turned out in genuine celebration. A gathering was organized at the church hall. Not quite a party, not quite a memorial, but something in between, a community marking the close of a wound that had quietly shaped the valley for 2 decades, without most residents ever fully understanding why. The Garrett family came 3 generations of them, the eldest, a stooped white-haired woman named Mavis Garrett, who had been a young bride herself when her family's land was stolen out from under them, who had spent the better part of her life believing the injustice would never be righted. She found Emma standing near the refreshment table and took both of Emma's hands in her own weathered ones, her eyes wet. I want you to know, Mavis said, her voice trembling with age and emotion, both that my husband died believing we'd lost that land forever. He never got to see this day, but I have grandchildren now who'll grow up on the same ground their great-grandfather worked because your father had the courage to write down what he found, and because you had the courage to carry it all those years and bring it home. She squeezed Emma's hands hard. That's not a small thing, child. That's not a small thing at all. Emma found she couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, and simply pulled the older woman into an embrace. Instead, the two of them standing together for a long moment, bound by a thread of justice, 20 years in the weaving. Across the hall, Luke watched the exchange with something fierce and proud swelling in his chest, and found Reverend Davies at his elbow, the same preacher who'd witnessed that first shocking reunion at the depot 3 years before. Quite a thing watching a wrong made right, Davies said quietly. I've buried a good many disappointments in this valley over the years, Luke. It's a fine thing to officiate something else for once. You officiated our wedding too, Reverend. Seems like you've had more than your share of fine things to witness where Emma and I are concerned. I suppose I have, Davies said, smiling. Though I'll confess, watching that woman step off the train 3 years back, recognizing your face mid-shout across a public platform, I didn't imagine that particular chaos would resolve itself quite this beautifully. The Lord does enjoy his surprises. Luke laughed genuinely, the sound easy in a way it had taken him years to relearn, after 2 decades of careful, guarded solitude. That he does. That evening, after the children had finally been wrestled into bed despite their excitement over the day's celebration, Luke found Emma standing once more beneath the old oak tree, the tin box's hiding place long since filled in, but the tree itself grown only taller, sturdier, more permanent with each passing year. You're out here a lot, he said, coming to stand beside her in the gathering dark. I like it here, Emma said. It's strange, for so many years, the things connected to my childhood here were wrapped up in loss. The creek, the fence rail, where I scarred my eyebrow, this tree. I couldn't think about any of it without thinking about everything that came after the running, the hiding, the 20 years of silence. She looked up at him, her face soft in the dim light. Now when I stand here, all I feel is grateful. That's new, Luke. I don't think I understood until today just how long I'd been waiting to feel that, instead of fear. Luke wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last gold light fade from the western ridge. I've been thinking, Emma said after a while, about my father, about all the things he never got to see. He died, still believing he'd failed us, failed to protect us, failed to bring the truth out into the light before it cost him everything he loved. Her voice caught slightly. I wish he could have known, that it didn't end in failure, that the truth found its way out eventually, even 20 years late, even after he was gone. Maybe he does know, Luke said quietly. Maybe wherever he is, he's watching his granddaughter grow up on land that's honestly his daughter's, married to a man who loves her exactly the way she deserves, surrounded by a town that finally understands what kind of courage it took to do what he did. Emma's eyes filled, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. I'd like to believe that. Then believe it, Luke said simply. Some things don't need proof, Emma. Some things you just choose to carry as true, because the carrying of it makes you better, for having believed it. The following spring brought another letter. This one considerably less dramatic than the last. An invitation, in fact, from the territorial governor's office, requesting Emma's presence at a ceremony in Cheyenne, honoring individuals who had contributed to significant reforms in territorial land record practices. The federal investigation into Vance's fraud had prompted sweeping changes to how survey records were filed, witnessed and protected against future tampering changes that would, the letter noted, likely prevent similar fraud from ever again going undetected for so long. They want to give me an award, Emma said, reading the letter at the kitchen table with an expression of bemused disbelief. You earned it, Luke said, not looking up from the ledger he was working through. I didn't do it for an award. I did it because I had to know the truth, and because I couldn't let what happened to my family happen to anyone else. That's usually how the most deserving recognitions happen, Luke said, finally looking up, smiling at her. The ones who actually deserve them never set out chasing them in the first place. They traveled to Cheyenne together that summer, the whole family this time, Eleanor insisting she wasn't about to miss watching Emma Whitmore Callahan stand up in front of the territorial governor after everything she'd survived to get there. The ceremony was modest by the standards of such things held in the same building that had once hosted the Land Commission hearing that changed everything, and Emma stood at the podium with their 2 children watching from the front row, Luke's hand lifted in quiet, steady support from where he sat beside Eleanor. I didn't set out to be brave, Emma told the small, gathered crowd, her voice steady, despite the nerves plainly visible in the way her hands gripped the podium's edge. I set out 20 years ago as a frightened 14-year-old girl, simply trying to survive a night I didn't understand. And later, as a grown woman, I set out only to know the truth about why my family had lost everything. If anything good came of it, if these reforms help protect other families from suffering what mine suffered, then I suppose the bravest thing any of us can do is refuse to let fear have the final word. My father taught me that even though it cost him his whole life to teach it. I only hope I've honored that lesson as well as he deserved. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, and as Emma stepped down from the podium, her eyes found Luke's immediately across the room, and the look that passed between them held 20 years of loss, and 3 years of healing, and a lifetime still ahead of everything they'd fought so hard to build. They stayed in Cheyenne 2 extra days before returning home, and on their final evening walking together through the territorial capital's busy streets, with their children trailing ahead, chasing each other with the boundless energy only small children seem to possess. Emma stopped suddenly outside a modest storefront window. Luke, look. He followed her gaze to a small hand-lettered sign in the window, Whitmore and Sons Land Surveying, Honest Measurements, Honest Records. Surely that's not... I don't know, Emma admitted, already moving toward the door. But I have to find out. Inside, behind a modest counter cluttered with surveying instruments and rolled maps, a young man in his 20s looked up at their entrance, and something in his face, the particular shape of his jaw, the careful, steady way he held himself, struck Emma immediately as familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. Can I help you folks? Your name... Emma said, her voice oddly breathless. Is it Whitmore? The young man's eyebrows rose. It is. Daniel Whitmore, named for my grandfather, actually, though I never knew him. My pa always said he was the most honest man he ever knew, even though it cost him everything in the end. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. Your father, what was his name? Samuel Whitmore. The young man studied her face now with growing curiosity. You knew him? He was my cousin, Emma said, tears already gathering the pieces, assembling themselves with dizzying speed. My father had a brother, your grandfather's brother, who I always understood had cut off contact with the family generations back before I was even born. I never knew there were Whitmores still in the territory. The young man's face transformed with shock and dawning recognition. You're Emma Whitmore. I read about you in the territorial paper, the land fraud case, 3 years back. My pa always wondered if the Daniel Whitmore in that story was kin to us. He passed 2 years ago without ever finding out for certain. I'm so sorry, Emma said softly. But I'm so glad, so unbelievably glad to find you now. What followed was an evening neither Luke nor Emma had anticipated when they'd set out that morning, gathered around the young surveyor's kitchen table with his wife and two small children, piecing together a family history that had splintered generations before. Either branch had fully understood why reuniting threads of kinship that had been quietly lost long before Vance's fraud had ever entered the picture. "It seems," Luke said later that night, as they finally made their way back to their hotel, exhausted but glowing with the particular joy of unexpected, hard-won family found, "that this valley has a way of returning things people thought were lost forever." "It seems that way," Emma agreed, leaning into him as they walked, their children finally tired enough to walk quietly between them, hand in hand with their parents. "First you. Now a whole branch of family I never knew existed. I begin to wonder if loss is ever truly permanent, or if it only feels that way until enough time passes to prove otherwise." "I think," Luke said slowly, "considering that some things are lost forever. Your parents, the 20 years we can't get back. Things that simply can't be undone, no matter how much healing follows after." He squeezed her hand gently. "But I think you're right, that other things only feel lost. Family, truth, love, even sometimes the kind that goes quiet for a while, but never actually dies, just waits for the right moment to come home again." They returned to the ranch a week later, and life settled back into its familiar hard-won rhythms. Cattle to tend, children to raise, a marriage to keep building, one ordinary grateful day at a time. But something had shifted in both of them during that trip to Cheyenne, a final settling peace that neither the fire, nor the hearing, nor even the wedding itself had quite managed to deliver. Emma began corresponding regularly with young Daniel Whitmore and his family, a relationship that deepened over the following years into genuine friendship, their children growing up knowing cousins they might otherwise never have discovered. The young surveyor, perhaps inspired by the family legacy he'd only just learned the full truth of, became known throughout the territory for the same uncompromising honesty that had once cost his great-uncle. Everything, a small, quiet echo of justice carrying forward into a new generation. The ranch prospered, the children grew. Eleanor lived long enough to see both of Luke and Emma's children married themselves decades later, standing beneath the same old oak tree where their parents had once dug up a rusted tin box of childhood promises. The tree itself now grown massive and ancient, its roots running so deep into the ground that nothing, not time, not loss, not even the worst that the world could throw at it, could ever fully uproot what had been planted there. And on quiet evenings, long after the children had grown and built their own lives, long after the fire and the fraud and the federal hearing had faded into the kind of family legend told and retold, until it took on the soft polished edges of myth, Luke and Emma would still find themselves walking out to that same tree hand in hand, the way they had at the very beginning. "Do you ever think about that day at the depot?" Emma asked him once, decades into their marriage, her hair gone silver, her hands soft with age, but still finding his with the same certainty they always had. "Every single day," Luke said. "I think about how close I came to never recognizing you. How if you'd worn your bonnet differently, or if the steam had cleared a moment slower, I might have simply greeted a stranger and never known the truth standing right in front of me. But you did know," Emma said softly. "Some part of you knew even before your mind caught up. Some part of me never stopped knowing." Luke agreed, lifting her hand to his lips. 20 years of silence, and I still knew you the instant I saw your face. I think that's the truest thing I've ever understood about love, Emma. It doesn't need proof or letters or even memory sometimes. It just knows. It waits however long it has to wait, and when the moment finally comes, it simply knows. They stood together beneath the old oak tree as the sun set gold and gentle over the valley they'd fought so hard to make honest again, two people who had lost 20 years to silence and fear and found against every reasonable expectation a lifetime of love waiting patiently on the other side of it. And in that quiet golden evening, surrounded by the land they'd reclaimed and the family they'd built and the truth they'd finally fully brought home, Luke Callahan understood with absolute unshakable certainty that some promises, however long delayed, however much they cost to keep, are always in the end worth every single year of the waiting.